Welcome to day 39 of Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today we're going through Exodus 22:16 through 24. And so far, if you've been with me through the chronological Bible reading plan, 1 year chronological Bible reading plan, which you can find online, we are on, in the book of Exodus, we have finished the book of Genesis and we have finished the book of Job. And so now we're kind of heavy in the middle of the book of Genesis. And at this point, we are with Moses and Aaron, and they are speaking to God. So they have already helped save the people out of Egypt, the Israelites out of Egypt. And Moses is now sort of establishing God's people as a group. Moses has a lot of jobs: teacher, prophet, judge, leader. So he's all of these things to them. And God has come down from the mountain, and he has shown that he is who he is, and he is speaking to Moses. And so he's come down in sort of thunder and lightning, and the people can hear that. They can't actually audibly hear God, but they can hear him coming down in thunder and lightning. And so they trust that Moses is the one speaking God's word, because that's God speaking from the mountain. And so we were at the point yesterday where we were listening to a whole bunch of the rules that Moses was coming down with. And so today we're sort of continuing on that a little bit. And so what I notice is in the very beginning, he's still moving on in sort of how they're working together in the community, right? Like, so how God is establishing his rules and boundaries for this people group, the Israelites. And so that's where we start in Exodus 22. And we're about halfway through Exodus 22 in this. So it starts actually at Exodus 22:16. So right away, I kind of want to get into this because this is another interesting, what I left you guys with yesterday is that I noticed sort of a hierarchy amongst the, I don't want to say people groups because they're all the Israelite people groups, but the hierarchy amongst the Israelites. So sort of men are in a certain place, women are in a certain place, slaves, servants are in a certain place. And so we're establishing a kingdom, sort of like we're establishing God's kingdom here on earth in this way. So he's making a list of laws and rules and things for all of them, to obey and to listen to and to follow as God's people. So the purpose is that they are God's people. I don't think they're supposed to look like everybody else. I don't think they're following the same rules as everybody else. I don't think he is establishing the same things that everybody else in that area has. And so I think he wants them to look different because he keeps calling them holy. And again, I've mentioned that holy is set apart, right? So this is something very different and very unique. So what he did start out with yesterday, I believe, is that he reminded them that he was the Lord their God, and he was taking them out of slavery. And then he started with all of his information. And then today we start with, if a man seduces, this is verse 16, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. Earlier, he had mentioned women as well, and this was sort of like women servants that he had mentioned, and if the man isn't happy with them and what they can do and how they can't sell her to foreigners, but they can take them for a son, and if they do, then they pay the bride price, right? So there's all of these things in place. In some ways, it seems to keep the women safe and protected, as people maybe who weren't able to fend for themselves in maybe those ways. And so they were meant to keep them protected. And this seems like more of the same. And so I even consider this a list of don'ts, right? So he's saying, if you do these things, right? So if the men take these virgins, then they need to marry them, right? And so I think in some ways, maybe it's a deterrent, right? So do not do this unless you want to be married, right? So I think it should, and could be a deterrent that men are to honor these women through either not seducing them as virgins, or if they choose to be with this woman and want to be with this woman, then they are to marry this woman. So it's more of a protection, I think, for both of them, So a man isn't to do anything without being married, and the woman is not to be used before used and not be married. Uh, she shouldn't be used in a marriage either, but that's a whole different story. So I think that in some ways it's these are to dos, in some ways these are sort of to don'ts, like don't do this, or you need to marry this woman. So and verse 18, I just find really interesting. It says, do not allow a sorceress to live. And why I find this interesting is because that means there were sorceresses. Does that mean there are still sorceresses? What does a sorceress do? Is a sorceress, which I'm assuming is female because of the S on the end, is she one who performs some kind of magical feat? Like, so I find it interesting. So he's not saying that they don't exist, but he is saying that whoever it is that does these things is not to live, which means that good does not come from that. So sorcery, in a way, is a bad thing. So it is not a thing of this God, of the God that we follow. So sorcery is a bad thing. I don't know if we will learn more details about what sorcery is, but I know that they must have known about it at the time and been familiar with what it is and been familiar with people that consider themselves sorcerers. Sorceress is. All right, now verse 22. It says, don't take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. And if you do, they will cry out to me. So this is where he goes a little bit more in depth. And I think that's the part I liked more than just the rule. Obviously, we shouldn't be taking advantage of the widow or the fatherless. But if you do, they will cry out to me, and certainly I will hear their cry. So there is a protection for these people. God is the protector for these people. So for any of us who are those people, God is saying he is our protector and he will hear our cry. And he says, my anger will be aroused and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows and your children will be fatherless. So it is a note to be very, very careful with what you do to other human beings, and to other human beings in this instance that don't have the same type of protection that you have. All right, moving on to 29 and 30. He's mentioned this before. In 29 and 30, he says, do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. I'm hoping maybe we'll get more details, but again, some of these things seem to be clearly understood by these people. They don't really need any more in-depth details, but does that mean they are promised as God's if needed? Does that mean they are to go to a place where they honor God, right? So they're to be separated from their family, because it says on the 8th day. So it says they can stay with their mothers for 7 days. So 1 week they can stay with their mothers, but then they're to go on the 8th day. So is every firstborn son to be given away in 8 days? Or is it just that they are, the firstborn son is God's child, and then the rest are the children of the people? And so I'm not 100% sure of the meaning of this. I'm hoping maybe we will get some more details. We'll have a little clearer understanding of what it means to be given to God in this way. And so if it's just, maybe they become priests, or maybe they become someone in the temple that does something, teachers, I'm not sure. So again, I think we'll get maybe into some more details. So moving on to Exodus 23, verse 2 says, do not follow the crowd doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, which is, I love some of these things that he points out, because these are some things that I think we deal with all the time, that it is really easy to go with the crowd. And sometimes there's safety in going with the crowd. And so he's telling us not to do that, and not because going with a crowd in general is wrong, but going with a crowd in the wrong way is wrong. Sometimes a crowd gets really fired up and they tend to do the wrong thing, or they're going the wrong way. And sometimes it's easier, most of the time, it's easier for a person to get lost in that and just be part of the crowd. And he's telling us not to do that. or he's telling them, I'm sorry, I have to keep correcting myself. He's telling them, the Israelite people, they are the ones that are supposed to be following these rules and laws. That's not necessarily all transferred over to us as followers of Christ. So I know I keep making that connection, but that's not always the connection that I should be making. This is specifically right now at this point to the Israelites. So in verse 10, he starts talking about the fields, and it says, for 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest your crops, but during the 7th year you let the land lie unplowed and unused. And again, here we go with the 6 days and the 7, right? So the 6 and the 7, he talks about a lot. He worked for 6 days and then he rested. We're supposed to work for 6 days. They're supposed to work for 6 days and then they're supposed to rest. And now it's the same thing with the fields. So the fields are supposed to be working for 6 years, and then there's supposed to be an entire rest year. And one of the things that he says in this year is that the poor can come and eat from it and the animals can come and eat from it. So it's still a blessing to other people and animals. It's just not for us to do. It's not for the it's not for the Israelites to do. It's for the poor amongst them and the animals who maybe aren't always getting everything. So the animals, the wild animals to eat in the fields. And then in verse 14, they start talking about Moses and God starts talking about festivals that need to be celebrated. So as of right now, they're yearly celebrating 3 festivals. And the first festival, which he seems to focus on the most, is the festival of unleavened bread, or the festival of the Passover. And I'm going to bring up the unleavened bread in a little bit, but the festival of the unleavened bread was when they came out of Egypt. Remember, it was something that they were told to remember every year. They celebrate 7 days with unleavened bread, and then they celebrate that last day with the Passover, as if, remember, they passed over because the door was covered in blood. And then the second one is about their crops. So the festival of the harvest, which is the first fruits, and the festival of the ingathering. So they get together all the time and they remember God. They remember the food that they've been given, right? So it's always this reminder and celebration of who God is and what God has done for them. So 19 is one that is another one I kind of think is at the end of 19, because in the beginning of 19 it says, bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord, right? So this is one that we've seen all the way back from the beginning. But then it says, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. And I'm bringing this up because it's curious, right? This is one that I'm absolutely no idea why this would be. I'm sure somebody has some kind of explanation or reason for doing this. But again, I would assume that the Israelites would know, because it seems something really standard with no long explanation. And it is in here, and it's something that they want them to do. I don't know if other people outside of the town cooked their young goats in their mother's milk, but the Israelites were told that they weren't to do this. And we have no reason why. So sometimes there are things that are in scripture that God says that we might need to leave, that we might need to say, not sure why it's in there. I'm not sure if it applies to me. And so I just need to leave it as it is. And if God wants for any reason for me to understand that, I believe he will show that to me. I believe he will open up my eyes and show that to me when and if needed. Moving on to keeping further down in Exodus. So in 20, so this is another thing where I'm curious about a timeline. So it says, see, I'm sending the angel. So now we're moving on. We're kind of getting away from the rules and we're moving along to what looks like it's going to happen in the future. So what looks like God's going to do for them. So he says, see, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Now I want to throw this out there because sometimes when I look at things, because I have read ahead, right? This isn't my first time reading through. So when I look at things, I clearly say, oh my gosh, this is a story of Jesus, right? So, however, saying that with a caveat, it might not be. He might not have been foreshadowing anything. He might have been talking about something that's going to happen in the very short future, and that's that. But to me, it either is foreshadowing, or this story, I want to say replica. It might not be the word I'm thinking of, but this story has similar aspects for a purpose. So then when Jesus does come, then we can see that this already happened with God's people in the past. So there could be multi-purposes to it, right? God could be directly speaking about who Jesus was, or God could be saying, you know, remember this when I did this with Moses and the Israelites. So, see, I'm sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive you your rebellion, since my name is in him. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all I say, remember those if-then statements I was saying before? I think these are really important. These are things that when we hear God saying them, that we want to be really careful to listen to, right? Like, I test you so you will not sin against me, right? So you're fearful of me, so you will not sin. So like these if thens are the same thing. I feel like we should be listening to them. If you listen carefully to what he says and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and will oppose those who oppose you, because we're his people. My angel will go ahead of you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I'm going to wipe them out. Do not bow down before the gods or worship them or follow their practices. So when they go, right, so he's saying this is what's going to happen. And when you go there, do not meet with them, befriend them, hang out with them, right? So these are not God's people. And so God clearly says, we're not fraternizing with them because they have their gods that they're following, and you are not to follow that God. So he says, uh, and if you do this, I will take away sickness from among you, and none will miscarry or be barren in your land. I will give you a full lifespan, which I think is really interesting because I'm not 100% sure what a full lifespan is. To 100, to 120, to 90. I'm not sure what that, or just does it mean it will be a very good and healthy life, right? So I'm not 100% sure what full lifespan means. So I like this too. I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you will encounter. So again, there's this idea that, um, again, going back to that Hagar story, I keep kind of really rehashing that Hagar story where she didn't see something that was there, and then it was there, right? So he throws them into confusion. So they're already sort of prepared to be ready to be destroyed by the Israelite people. So he's already doing something to them, and we don't know what necessarily that is, but he's already doing something to them. He's messing with their land. He's confusing them in such a way that that they're prepared to be essentially prepared to be destroyed. All right, moving on to Exodus 24. Just a couple here. So one of the very beginning in verse 1, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance, but Moses is alone. So Moses is the only one that's going up. They're all going up towards God, but Moses is the only one that's actually going up in the clouds and seeing God. So he's the only one that's able to approach. And then in verse 5, it says, then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings. So this is the first time we've seen these things. So burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, which is fellowship, being in community together. So these are offerings that they're offering to God. Then he takes the blood and he pours it and he sprinkles it over them. So verse 7, he says, and I'm not 100% sure what this is. If this is what, again, so this is, he took the book of the covenant, he said, and read it to the people. So is the book of the covenant just these laws that he was making, right? Or is this going all the way back to Abraham, right? In the book of Genesis, and he's learning all about Abraham, because it is the book of the covenant, and Abraham was one of the ones. Actually, Noah had a covenant with God as well. So is Moses reading over all of this with them? Because thinking that Moses is the author of those books, is he the one that's doing that? And he read it to the people, and they responded, we will do everything the Lord has said and we will obey. And then the blood gets sprinkled all over them. So now they have a covenant with God. The blood has been sprinkled on them. This is from the offerings from God. And now all of these people now have a covenant with God that says, we will obey everything that you say. We're going to obey what you do. And then Moses and Joshua go up to get like these written tablets. So in verse 13, it says Moses set out with Joshua at his side, which I thought was funny because I didn't realize that Joshua had such a huge part in all of this. I thought it was mostly Aaron, but Moses and Joshua seem to go up. Joshua is Moses's aide, and then Aaron and Hur were down sort of around the other people. And so he says, wait for us to come back. And if you have any kind of dispute, you can go to them. So Moses went up on the mountain, a cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on the mountain. After 6 days, again, here we go, 6 days, on the seventh day, God called Moses up to him. And then Moses was up there with him for 40 days and 40 nights. But what the people saw, so it says the cloud came down, but what the people saw was a consuming fire. So I think that's a really big word. It's more than a blazing fire, right? Consuming is kind of like eating everything, right? So what they see is this fire that's eating everything up on the mountain. And again, going all the way back to where God makes this covenant and he's represented by fire. Same thing. So he's consistently represented by fire coming down on the mountain at this time and talking to Moses. So we sort of know that God and Moses are having a conversation at this point, and the people are seeing a consuming fire, which isn't really consuming anything because it's not coming down on the mountain. It's just staying in that area where God is up there with Moses. So again, he's up there 40 days and 40 nights, and that's where we end for today. So that's where we finish up. Tomorrow, we're going to start on Exodus 25, and it is going to be day, I think maybe 40 we're going to be up to by tomorrow. So if you like this, if this has been a blessing, like it, share it, subscribe. So these things pop up for you every day. So you can stick with me, stick with your reading, keep doing it. We are right in the thick of things, figuring out so much about God and Moses and what Moses is, and then what that means, what that's eventually going to mean for us as people who follow Christ. So keep reading, and I'll see you next time.